All right, I'm gonna share my screen. It's awesome. Sonia, let me know in the chat if you can hear me okay and you can see my screen. Yes, okay. While you're on the stage, if you need my attention, you just say something and I'll switch back to the Discord screen. All right, hi everyone. Thank you for joining us on today's stream. Last week, we set up the network uptime page for all the Shardeum services that we're monitoring. And that went pretty well. I think we achieved what we wanted to achieve last week. So right now it's working as expected as we set it up. But this week, what I want to do is set up the latency graph so that we can see the response times for each of the individual services that we're monitoring. Let's get right into it. So we already have our fetch status function that we set up last week. So this would give us the last 10 most recent records from all the data pulls we do across our services. So what we want to do now is create a new page. So we've got the uptime page, we've got the home page. So I'm going to create a new page here. Let's do latency. I'm actually going to zoom in a little bit. I think it's better like that for people who are watching on video. Okay, and then in here, I'm going to make a new file. Let's call it page.tsx. This is just a Next.js syntax. And we can create the page that we want to set up here. So let's call this function maybe latency page. Okay, and what would happen here is basically we're going to bring in our fetch status function. Let me import that. And let's import our service type. Maybe we can do that later. Let me make this an async function. So what we want to do first is get our data from fetch status, and then we can grab those 10 most recent services out of data, and then let's return some JSX. So I'm just going to say hello, but what I really want to do is to log this to see if I'm in fact getting that data from the fetch status. Cool. So I would expect if I go to let me see if I'm running on my servers. I'm seeing a lot of things are offline. Oh, I see that I have services running. Okay. I will look at this later. But I see that I'm getting all my records. Let me see. Let me pull up a little bit. Perfect. All right, cool. So now that I'm getting the data, what I want to do is set up my latency graph. I could do it in here as well, but I want to, let me just make a different file for it. So let's call it latency graph. Okay, so here we can create that graph, and I want to use this tool called React Apex Charts. This is the tool I'm going to use to create that latency graph. So let's install that. I'm going to okay, I think that's cool. All right, so let's set it up then. So I'm going to, because we're using Next.js 14, everything is client, every component, every page is client side, is server side by default. So if you want to use like client side packages like this one, you need to mark the component as clients, and that way you can access the browser and everything. So let me grab chart from that React Apex charts. And then let's export this function. We can call it latency graph. Two things that will pass into this function. What will happen at the end of the day is we're going to just import it here and render it here, as opposed to just showing a hello world stuff. And what we want to pass in here is this data, the services is what we want to pass there. So let's do data and maybe name as well. I'm going to go with data for now. If we need name, I will add it later on. So I have my data. It's going to be any. And then what I want to do is basically start configuring the chart. So Apex chart has different types of charts that you can create. This one is a bar chart. This is a line chart, which is what we want. So let's set up the configurations for it. This is going to be, actually, let's set up. The first thing that you pass into the chart component is the options or details, or basically an object that contains all the information about your chart, the y-axis, the x-axis, and all the data about the series you want to show. So let's set that up. I'm going to call it options. That's what they usually call it in the docs. And this will have the chart object. It will also have the, I think it's x-axis. I will confirm this to be sure. That's how it's spelled. I think it's capital A, but I'll check later. There's also y-axis. Then there's I think stroke. If we miss any of this, I will check the docs to confirm. And we can pass some colors to it to represent, this will be an array to represent each individual service so that they just look different from each other. And then maybe a title to give the chart a name. Okay, so we can start setting this up actually. For the chart, it will take an ID, and I think this is where I need to specify that name, so that the name of the chart will be whatever name we pass in. And let's make it a string. All right, so we've got an ID for the chart. The type, this is where we specify the type. So we want a line chart, like I showed you just now. And then animations, just so that it looks fancy when you open the page. It has this fancy animation, a linear animation that happens, which I really like. So let's enable that and set the easing to linear. So all of these properties you can probably find out what they do and what they are in the Apex React charts docs. But I'm just going to go ahead and use them. So this is going to be dynamic animation speed. So we can set the speed to 2 seconds. So that would make it a little bit fast. And then for the x-axis, if you look at the examples, you see that it specifies the categories and it's an array that takes a couple of values. This will be the values that you would expect to see here at the bottom part of the line chart. What we want to put there in our own latency graph is the time that it takes for the different intervals that we make the service calls. So I'm going to define it as an empty array for now. When we bring in our data from the page.tsx file, then we can basically update this. So let's do categories is going to be an array, actually an array of strings. I'm just going to initialize it like this for now, and then we'll update it later. Then for the y-axis, this is where we set up, well, everything we want to have on this part of the latency graph, and that is going to be our response times. So let's give it a border so that it's easier to see. And show the border, let's set that to true, and let's give it a color. I don't know what this color is, so I'm gonna get my own color. Okay, and then let's give the y-axis a title, because I want to give it a name so it's more intuitive when you look at it, so you know what exactly it is. And the text for the title will say, let's do response time. Yeah. And we can style it a little bit. The reason I want to style it is like when I looked at this before, it doesn't look very good without some custom styling. The font is usually too big. So I want to resize that to 10 pixels. And maybe we can give it a custom color as well. We use the same one. Okay, so I think that's that for our y-axis. Then for the stroke, it's usually basically how you want the strokes of each service to look like. You want it to be smooth, you want it to be straight. I'll set it to be straight though for this use case. Or I can actually use smooth, and basically gives me the opportunity to show you the difference. And then for the colors, I already have an array of colors that I want to use and represent all of the colors that will represent the different services for me. So I'm going to put that here, just a bunch of different colors. I didn't put much thought into it. And then for the higher level title, we're just going to set the text to be the name that we pass in. And we are going to align it to the left. And that's it. Okay, so I think our chat options is ready. I will stop here with the config, and I'll just move on to the next thing. And if we need to tweak this a little bit more, we will tweak it when we get there. All right, I'm going to collapse that. Then the next thing I want to set up is the series. The series is basically the data of all the services that you want to plot on the graph, right? And we'll get that data from this data variable we pass into this function. So let's do, I'm going to just currently initialize it as an empty array as well. So, and then what I'm going to do is map through that data that we bring in. So for each of the data we bring in here, we're going to push that into this series. But not everything about the data. We just want the name of that service and the duration, basically how long it took us to fetch that data. So I can do, let me do this inside let's call this data series. It's going to be data, and for each service in the data, let's make this any, I will type it later. Then I want to do series.push, and I want to push the name, which will be service.name, not series, service.name, and then I want to push the data, and this would be, so the data is going to come from the latest 10 services data. If you were here last week, we saw how we set up the structure of that data. So I'm just going to go ahead and access it. If it breaks, we'll fix it. So we call it last 10 services. and this will basically hold all the data of the last 10 services for each service that we pulled. So let's map through it and grab our services out of it. And we want to return the duration. I think it's service dot label or service dot status. Yes. Dot labels, and then the duration of that service. Let me see the structure of that again. Yes, so for each of those services, we have this last 10 services array that contains all of the data we want, and we have this status object that holds the labels, and inside the labels is where we have our duration that holds the time that it took us to poll for that particular service. So this would push all of this data into the series for us, and then so this should account for our y-axis data. So let's do for x-axis. So let's do x-axis is going to be, I'm going to grab this from the first item. So one of these, either one of these services would hold all the different timestamps, and that's what we need. So we just grab the first one and map through it. And okay, let's do this first. So what we want to do in this x-axis is convert that time to a time that we can display. At the moment, I think our timestamps are all integers, so we can use a number for this. So let's do create that variable. Let's call it time, or let's call it date time. We're going to use do international excuse me, date time format. We use in US, and what I want to do is just hour to be numeric. Let's put this in a string, and minutes. For this, you can probably even set for years and basically go all the way, but I'm only going to do hour and minute. And then let's format that, because again, the timestamp it has to be a number, and that's going to be our service.status. The same way that we got our duration is how we get our timestamp. So service.status.labels.timestamp. And then what we want to do after this, so this would account for our y-axis, this would account for our x-axis, and then let me return some JSX here, which would represent the chart. So here can do some styling. Actually, okay, let me just give this image on bottom of 16 pixels for now. And then we will render our chart and pass in all the options and all the series. So we've got the options here. So let's do options. It's going to take options as any, and series, we're going to pass in our series, and then the type is going to be line. It's going to be line, and we pass a height, width. No, I'm just going to do height and use the default width. This be 520 pixels. Okay. Now, what we can do is import this in here. Let's import our latency graph inside of our home page. Hang on, what did I call it again? Latency graph. Okay. Actually, I want to do dynamic import. Let me do that again, because again, because the latency graph file is a client component, I want to dynamically import it as opposed to do regular import, because then it will throw errors when we try to run the project. So let me import next dynamic. Then I can do const latency graph. Okay, this is what I need. So now we are grabbing our latency graph. And then what would happen is we can show the latency graph here, and the data we need to pass into it will be our services, which is holding the latest 10 records, and the name will be let's call it latency graph, maybe. And this should do it. Okay, I expect things to break, so let's try to find out what would happen. Going to, oh, hang on, it's not, did I stop? Oh, I did. Okay, let's run this again, see if this one's running, see if Prometheus is running. Okay, so I will check back on the browser, and then if I go to latency, okay, yes, like I said, I expect things to break. Status, I'm not spelling that right. Latency graph.tsx, let's see, when we're pushing data in status. Okay, invalid time value. Oh, I think I'm probably using timestamp instead of timestamp. Yay, look at that. We're getting the data back. Okay, so first thing I want to change is the styling is a bit off, so let's fix that. Let me get rid of this first. So we're using Tailwind CSS, so it makes things a bit easier for me. So let's do flex column. Let's center items, and let's give it a padding of 24 pixels, not negative. And yes, I want a white background. I mean, it's already white background by default. Okay, let's have maximum width. No. Let's have a max width of 4 XL and a full width. Then I can have my latency graph here. No. Oh, I thought I copied it. All right, let's do it again. Latency graph. Data is services. Name is latency graph. And okay, so it's looking a bit better now. And let me look at the height. Is 250, it's too low. Let's increase that to 520. There we go. Okay, so this is looking much better. Something that let me see how much time we got left before I do another thing. Okay, we are actually up on time. It's exactly 6 p.m. on my side. What I would do next, okay, let me stop here. But what I wanted to do now is split this into multiple services. Right now, it has both our Explorer server, our Monitor server, documentation, archiver, website, all of this. So what I want to do is split it up into two different latency graphs. The first one is going to just focus on the servers, which is our Monitor server, our JSON RPC server, and the archiver servers. And then I'm going to have a second graph that focuses on the websites, you know, our Explorer, documentation, and the Shardeum.org website. So that's maybe we'll do that next time, so that I've made a commitment to not go over time anymore. But yeah, I will stop here today. And next week we're going to have Sonia come on the stream, and she's going to walk us through how to get started with open source. Right, that is a session that I'm looking forward to. It's going to be very practical. She's going to take us from not doing anything open source related to making your first open source contribution, right? So I think that's going to be very helpful. And if you can make it, please join us next week as we go through that session. So thank you everyone if you joined us today. This is what we wanted to get done on this stream, and we've got it working. Next stream, after Sonia's stream on open source, we can do what I talked about. You know, we can split this graph into two and do a couple of other things to just make this a much better product for everyone. So thank you all for joining us today, and I will see you all again the same time next week. Bye everyone. Sonia, do you have any last words before I end the stream with respect to your session next week?
Yeah, so I think you have mostly covered everything.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm very excited for the upcoming stream. So do join everyone, and I'm very excited about it.
Awesome. Thank you all for joining us today, and we will see you again next week.